Awesome. Cool. Yeah, so I don't want to waste any more of your time. We can just go ahead and kind of get started. I just wanted to start off by saying thank you so much. It's an honor to share space with you here today. And thank you so much for taking the time to meet and talk stories with us. I know it's at the end of the semester, it's really jam-packed for everyone, but we really appreciate it. We're so excited, not only for our group project, but it's just simply an honor to be able to listen and learn from you and your stories, especially given your field and the work that you do. We think you have such a unique positionality and perspective on some of the larger themes and questions that we're seeking to explore through our project. So all this to say, thank you so much. I wanted to start by kind of just grounding us in a little about our project. I know I had sent you like the email regarding like our questions and stuff, but just kind of situate us into this space. The practice of talking stories refers to the way we're in relation to one another, where we make space and time for oral practices of sharing our experiences. Using this framework, we are seeking out ways that scholars who place emphasis on centering marginal voices are approaching their work and their praxis, along with learning the stories of themselves. So how they're kind of situating their own identities into these concepts. And combined through this reflexivity, we're looking at how these narratives are showcasing their relationships to time, place, space, and land. And that's kind of like our larger governing themes for the project. And utilizing this medium of talking stories, both myself and my other classmate, Shione, were Pacific Islander, and that's a very big practice in our culture. And we are kind of using that as a framework to have kind of just like this organic interaction as much as possible through this Zoom space that can bring people together and kind of work to recuperate past that have, for example, been deliberately forgotten or excluded. So that's kind of an overview of our project. And we have an interview protocol of our own that involves kind of centering ourselves into this sacred space of talking stories. And we'd like to start with that. And I can go ahead and start myself, but basically we'll go ahead and say who we are, where we come from, where we call home, and who we're bringing into this space here with us. So I'll start, and then Rachel, and then we can kind of go into our first initial question, if that's okay with you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okiana Lynn Makayan Anderson Ko Inoa no Hilo Waikea Uka Ahupua Amayao. Hello, my name is Kiana Lynn Makayan Anderson. I'm from the Big Island of Hawaii, the Waikea Uka area. I'm in the PhD program for literature here, and my interests, like my research interests, are in like the Pacific Islander identities and its intersections with Asian American and using frameworks of like decolonial, post-colonial, indigenous theory to kind of ground that research. And with me, I'd like to bring in the stories of my ancestors. I've been particularly honoring my Apo, my great-grandfather, who was a cicada worker on the plantations on Hawaii. He migrated from the Philippines, and he just passed this, it's going to be his 1 year anniversary of his passing. And so I'd like to bring him into this space with us. And if you want to go ahead, Rachel.
I just want to echo Kiana's appreciation for sharing this time and space with us. I know when I reached out to you initially, my email is having such issues. And so I really do appreciate that you hung in with us through that, because it was a little bit frustrating. So hello, my name is Rachel James. Part of my name is self-given. And with that comes part of the theme of like what I've been searching for, like looking at concentrating in my graduate studies, which is in English literature at the moment. And that is in American literature, the mythology of it all, and identity. And so who I bring with me into this space is all of basically the ancestors, the women particularly, whose names I don't know, but who I would like to know and whose stories I'm trying to like hold. And yeah, thank you so much for being here with us. So I think Shauna's internet may have been a little bit weird just because of Zoom, which is always such an interesting space to gather. I know that she's here with us still. Sometimes this happens during class where she'll have to go off a video camera for a bit. But going into that, then it kind of leads into our first question of who are you and where do you call home?
Okay. Ja, też Bojan Lewis Yunashia. I'm Nakaidenebor Ashihi, so Mexican clan born for Salt clan. My nullies were, or sorry, my Chis were Tutney Sunday and my nullies are Bella Ghana. So I come from Flagstaff and Window Rock, kind of both, I consider. I think I had developmental experiences that have definitely resonated and stuck with me. And I bring to this space my family, who I live with now, my wife and daughter, and also my grandparents and my parents, and all my relations who I constantly think about when I write and engage in storytelling or poetry. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Arizona, split between creative writing and the American Indian Studies program. This is my third year here at the university and in Tucson, so getting used to two new things. And thank you for having me. Hasn't been too stressful, so don't worry about it.
I feel like I remember you from when you started at the U of A, maybe 3-ish years ago. You came and spoke in Susan Briante's class and you read a bit of your poetry. And it was right around that time of probably when you first came here. And it left an impression. Just words and like how you spoke about the story behind like the actual poetry that you were like sharing with us was really wonderful and really beautiful. And so yeah, I remember a bit of what you did then, and I'm glad you're still here and hopefully settling in.
Yeah,
Apologies. My internet drops. I moved to like a better place, like right by the router. So hopefully it doesn't do that again. I was wondering if maybe you could tell us a little bit of the work you do with like your creative writing, just to kind of get a sense of like what type of work and like maybe like the languages that you're choosing to write in as well. I think that would be really helpful.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm a multi-genre artist, I suppose. My first book, Currents, was a book of poetry. And that was largely a consideration of like form and sort of examining Western practices of form and sort of like settler colonial forms and what that sort of means for poetry. But also trying to break out of that and examine other forms and other cultures who aren't so, I guess, like the dominant scope. So this could be like Arabic forms or Southeast Asian forms, like the Pantun, which is like we talk about like forgetting or misremembering. I mean, the French sort of co-opted that, and everyone assumes it's a French form, but it's actually a Indonesian form, I think, or so, yeah. So like, that was the structure, and so I filled it with, I guess, the themes that I was sort of living and concerned about with at that time, which is like my work as an electrician, and as a sort of, I don't know, like a student or a practitioner of story and of literature. And I was really drawn to the tercet, I think, because I liked trilogies. I liked like I play music a lot, and I grew up playing music, so like triplets and triad chords are always like of a big interest to me because they were like deemed the devil's chord because they're so discordant. So all my examinations of threes, I just kept I guess looking for every possible sort of combination of history in different genres, different literatures, different belief systems. You know, a lot of that doesn't make it into the book. It's all just sort of like what I'm thinking about, and sort of helps me, you know, get into those bigger conversations than just like expressing myself, I suppose. It does lead me to engage in a larger conversation with literature, and I guess like outside literatures, and like the stories of my grandparents and their grandparents, you know, all to say ancestors. But so with that, I used 3 languages. I wrote in English, and I started trying to sonically incorporate Navajo or Diné and Spanish, and trying to find sort of sonic resonances between the 3 languages, because like meaning making at that point just seemed, I don't know, moot for me. So that was what I was working on with that book. But now I have a collection of short fiction coming out with Grey Wolf Press in September of 2022. And that's like a totally different like mindset. So it's short fiction. With those stories, I really wanted to engage like sort of my love of realist fiction. I'm not really big into like horror or sci-fi or speculative fiction or genre fiction, though I've tried to venture those ways quite unsuccessfully. So those were also just like sort of mining those experiences of contemporary Native life or Indigenous life. You know, I think like a lot of my favorite authors like Gerald Visner or Louise Erdrich or Toni Morrison, they all write about like they write like historical novels, and I could relate to those, but like also not really. Like I'm like, this is stuff my parents went through or my grandparents went through. It's still important, like those issues, and like giving life to those experiences through the storytelling, right? So we can examine and empathize with our past relatives, or who were living through these atrocities, challenges, or changes. But like I rarely saw literature that was like addressing what I was going through or what I was interested, or people my age or anything. And like so it was trying to, I guess, enter the conversation that way. And working on a new book of poetry that's all forms again. It's really like a meditation on the Arabic form of the ghazal and the Japanese form of the haiku. So combining them and then separating them, and then thinking about, rather than just the formal like poetic components like meter or rhyme or structure, like what the sort of cultural or imagination, the implication of imagination is with those forms. And also the ghazal is really closely tied to music in the Arabic and Urdu traditions. So also like incorporating musical or sonic aspects with those at some point. That's sort of like a slower process as I figure out how to combine the two, because I've long been like, poetry and music aren't the same, they're very separate things. So now I'm fighting against myself and being like, okay, but how do I combine them? How do I talk about that? So that's, I guess, my work at present.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm so interested in what you said about like trying to like sonically incorporate these languages, because the more like I read and listen to other people's stories, I realize that a lot of the story and the memory is often housed outside of language itself. And so as writers, to try to like incorporate that within the language that we have of writing is just so awesome. And I think that's the power and beauty of poetry, that it can do that, whereas like traditional like essay or, you know, like works of theory, there's a lot that is excluded when we try to theorize memory or story, which so all that said, that's super, super interesting. Thank you so much for that. And then I guess that kind of leads into our second question. And again, these questions are super broad, so feel free to take it like whatever direction. That was like our intent, is how do you approach theory and praxis like within the work that you do? In our specifically for like this, our group project, it is a theory course. And so part of like kind of the tension that we've been running up against is we're so interested in story and storytelling and memory, and how theory sometimes runs up against that and causes us to kind of categorize or assign it a specific space or a specific moment in time. So we're interested in hearing like how you, if you do work with theory, how you might incorporate that or not incorporate that within your work and teaching as well.
Yeah. I like to read theory, I think I spent a lot of time especially as a younger writer, maybe even pre-grad school or after grad school, and investigating, I don't know, like, yeah, and I guess investigating different literary theories, mostly like non-American, because I feel like all theory at this point, like I think post-colonial theory was, I don't know, relatively new. Maybe it wasn't as broad. Like when I was in school, that book about like decolonizing methodologies had just come out. It was still pretty recent, It took me a few years to read it after it came out because it was so theory heavy. So like it was like in the atmosphere. There weren't really any theory courses that I could take that really addressed those things. I didn't want to, I think. So it still felt like colonial. It still felt like the academy. It still felt very Americanized in that sort of violent erasure sort of way. So I read a lot of European or non-American theories, like Edward Galeano, who's an Uruguayan writer. I forget the name of the book. It's like The Open Veins of Latin America or something like that. I'm forgetting the title right now. I read that. I read a lot of Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, stuff like that. I think I can't remember, Hungarian, this E.M. Siron. I read a lot of that. Georges Bataille, who's a French philosopher. So I started looking like outside the US just to think about what that kind of like theory was, I guess, mentioning, and also like maybe Cisla Miloš and Primo Levi. So writers of the Holocaust, writers who were concerned with totalitarianism and memory. So like Primo Levi's The Saved and the Drowned or something like that. Is like a meditation on memory, and like, he's like, World War II happened, this great most recent atrocity happened of this genocide, right? And there's some historians that claim that Hitler was inspired by the genocide of the American Indians here in the States, because he's like, people just forgot, like it was easily forgotten and erased. So like, what's a few million Jewish lives? And so Primo Levi's biggest concern is like, how long is it going to take before people start forgetting about this? And it was, pretty quick. Like people deny it. Like even now, it's like it didn't happen. And the genocide of indigenous peoples here is largely attributed to like disease, or we just sort of vanished or something, right? And it erases that very theorized and like planned, and there was a plan made and an execution of genocide, right? So it was like, the killing and then the assimilation and the removal, and we can go on and on. So I looked outside to figure all that out for myself, So when I approach theory, it's always, I guess, with trepidation. It's like this, it's the second thing, or even the fourth, maybe the fourth thing I think about in my own writing, but I do read it. I do find value in it. It often makes me think of narratives or poems because I want to like humanize it, I guess. I want to give it, like, theory is hard to empathize with because it's just a theory, right? Like theory is like, it's like, you know, this is might be a way of thinking, and it's like, okay. And so like when you start assigning things and categorizing things, it ultimately starts dehumanizing things, right? Because it's like, theoretically, these people are human in this way, like, you know, or theoretically history happened in this way, which is all fine. And it, you know, it's important to discuss, but when it comes to, I think, to being an artist and like thinking about being a storyteller or a poet or a musician, you know, there's a large amount of intuition and imagination, I think, that theory could potentially drown out. So like when I teach writing, it's like, you know, try to trust your intuition and like foster your imagination. Like try to imagine your characters in different spaces. So when I do bring theory into class, like this was a, I think, pretty eye-opening experience. This semester, I taught a, excuse me, Intro to American Indian Studies course. My first time doing it, it's kind of intimidating because it felt more academic or more theoretical than like my sort of artistic expertise. So I sort of psyched myself out. But what I learned from it is like, you know, in terms of like theory and practice, how to like apply that to a curriculum and discuss that with students. I think it was just like being transparent about my own distrust of it, and like that it's not everything, I guess, that it should constantly be challenged or questioned, or I don't know. I think what the main point that came out of all that this semester was like sort of how we treat Native American literature, and what in terms of like it is experiencing like and long overdue sort of proliferation. Like there's more publishers publishing Native writers. There's more like journals having like Native editors. I feel like it's more in our popular sort of culture, right? We have like reservation dogs, and it's largely being written, produced, and like acted by like Native people. So like this important thing is happening, but what also is happening is like at the very end of all that, there's someone who's paying for all this, and that's usually like not Native people. It's just like, okay, Res Dogs is produced and by Native people, but like ultimately it's Hulu who is giving the final sort of verdict on everything, right? And so my students and I got burned out this semester. We read Louise Erdrich's The Night Watchman, and then we read the whole Norton Anthology of Native Nations poetry, which was a daunting task. And I don't know if we're the better for it, but we probably are, but it was very intense. I think because, you know, I think being from, and you know, the importance of our stories and like why we need to tell them is like we've experienced a lot of generational trauma. We have a lot of historical trauma. And then we have a moment where like sort of maybe like elements of shame, silence, and our own erasures sort of are happening with certain ways we express ourselves or tell those stories. So what we ended up like really noticing is like, wow, this is a really bummer course because we're just reading about Native people and all their hardships, or all the trauma they experience. And a few students were like, oh, like when can I read a book about a Native person just going about their day that ends happily? It doesn't end with like a death or like an assault or something, you know? And it was like, yeah, like what, there are those stories out there, but why aren't we reading them? And so it's like, so, you know, we're looking at everything that's sort of being published right now. And it is all sort of like trauma or historical based. Like there's some like element of violence that happens. I think about my own writing. But it's like, okay, we're all tied up in it. You know, my personal experience is not a very happy one, or, you know, it's not without its violence or traumas or addictions and all that sort of stuff that fits in. And so being very transparent about that, I think even helps students to be like, well, at some point, yeah, we are going to have to start like flipping that script. And what is the theory maybe behind that? What is the writing not happening, or maybe not, maybe it's happening, but, you know, publishing is so slow, especially with academic stuff, because you got to get your stuff peer reviewed and it takes forever. By the time it comes out, it's like old. And you have to just keep, you know, doing that vicious academic cycle. So it's like, you know, story is a living embodiment of the artist. You know, I had a really hard time like being like, I guess it's like vulnerability I don't think is welcomed in theory by the practitioner or the writers. Like being vulnerable is a no-no, especially as you encounter the old guard of the academy. They're very like, it's rigor, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's all their sort of protocol, right? It's like, well, if we're to theorize in an indigenous way, it's like there should be an amount of vulnerability that I, as the person delivering or leading the conversation or telling the story, need to engage with. And so I was like, well, I'll tell my students that, yes, I went through these like experiences and this happened to my family, or, and you know, all that shit just brought me here, luckily. But like, where is that story? You know? And personally, it's like, well, I have to mine, as a writer, I have to mine all this stuff out first before I can get to like, I don't know, writing maybe a short story about a successful Native person who's a professor. Like, there's almost like an emotional ladder I have to climb first. So I think in the delivery of that theory and praxis, it's like that vulnerability, that transparency, I don't think we see from our professors or our artists. A lot of the time we're very guarded. And there's, you know, good reason for that. Like if I were just to keep talking to this about this like every week, I would probably do some harm to myself. So maybe some boundaries as well. I hope that answers your question.
No, yeah, and it was a beautiful answer too that kind of tied into our third question of like, what is the role of storytelling? I really appreciate how you stated that being transparent about that distrust is what allows theory to be used or not used. And like, I think that is really powerful and something that we have been kind of coming to terms with like a very strict theory course where we have to start with Freud and go to Marx and then go down the line where we end with decolonial and post-colonial. And over the course of the semester, we've been kind of challenging that and just really questioning why that has to be in place. And I think what you said about just being transparent about that distrust is like a way into theory where we might not do that harm that it threatens whenever we use it. And I think a lot of recent scholarship I've been fortunate to like read has been in some ways doing that work of like using footnotes, for example, to tell like a secondary storyline, which is really, I think, a cool technique to insert yourself into like that conversation where it's traditionally that, like you said, that vulnerability isn't welcome. And so like that's like a cool way that I've been seeing footnotes being used. And Rachel and I are in this like side group called Academic Fissures, where we just read a bunch of theory that we're super interested in and talk about. And one of our colleagues posed the question, which I've just been coming back to, is like, what if instead of applying theory to poetry, we applied poetry to theory? And to think about shifting that, I don't know, like that traditionalness to theory, to incorporate art not as like an extension of theory, but as the theory itself, is like really, really powerful. And so I really appreciate you stating that and saying like there is that emotional ladder that you have to climb and you have to address certain things in order to navigate within that space. But it's definitely doable. And my hope is that with this project, we will be able to contribute to that that entanglement of art, because I like to see theory almost as art, as a transition back into art, which is what we need in life right now. So thank you so much. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Rachel, please.
I was going to say, I'm so glad that you brought up that quote, what if we applied like poetry to theory instead of theory to poetry? Because I just always associate it with, like it's just something that's been on our minds collectively this semester, which is a really hard thing to tackle, I think, for us. A course that's just very theory heavy, because what it's demanding of us is to be taking this distanced, like objective space when it comes to applying thought to the world. And I think one of the things that I most appreciate about this project and talking with everybody about their work is this like kind of just this understanding across disciplines that we cannot be separated from our work and we cannot be separate from theory or just the world. And it's tiring, but also necessary. And I was just going to say, I dropped a quote in the chat from Shione, who couldn't be here today, but she provided us with this really great quote from The Ancestors We Get to Choose by Tiawa. I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, but I do not like theory when it's used as a weapon. I especially dislike theory when it is used like a silence on a gun. I prefer to see and use theory as a frame, a magnifying glass, a key, a plow, a sail, an oar. And when you were talking, it just made me think of this, about how often we wield theory as a way to, like, I don't know, to separate us from our work or from other work or from lived experiences, as this kind of this, I think it's a ladder itself in terms of how well you know theory and who you're utilizing and who you can quote. And so it's just like, it's an interesting thing for me to like be able to more and more put language to why that's problematic. So everything that you said, I'm very thankful for, because you gave us a lot to think about with that answer. I always like the answers that are kind of, that take in just so much of who's providing the answer in the world. So it was great.
Yeah, and I think you touched on kind of like the role of stories and storytelling in your work. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, but we can transition kind of from that into how you see and approach space and time with your work. And we've been specifically interested in this concept of temporality in relation to theory, but also like outside of theory, how you're viewing that within academia and also outside of academia in those stories.
Yeah, that's like, I think, the hardest question. Yeah, I think like time is, I think, a big theme in my work, a big sort of consideration in my process. Even like when I make music, time is something very literal, like the time signature of the piece, whether it's like 4/4, 4/6, or whatever it is, beats per minute, like that very literal sense of time in music. But also like, I think of like, well, maybe I'll talk about literature first, but sort of like, like a Dene perspective, or how I was raised, I think, in my more traditional sense. I was also raised with like Catholicism and Mormonism, which are very linear, very, I don't even want to say literal, but they're very linear and very prescribed, I guess. And like also open to very, like that's like theory to me too. It's like these religious ideas are theories. And then when you put them into practice, they become weapons because they can be interpreted and misquoted and misconstrued in so many ways. It's almost designed that way, you know, like if you look at how texts have been cut up into verse, into passages, you know, if you just clip one of those, it's a very powerful little poem that can be misconstrued. And if you don't like read the whole thing or the whole gospel or the whole whatever it may be, you know, you can do anything with it. And this is like all religions. Religious texts were a very big influence for me as well. I was a religious studies minor in my undergrad. And the only reason I didn't pursue the major is because like all the theory and like I would have to write these very sort of daunting academic papers. And I was like, this is just gonna frustrate me and I'll never graduate. So I just kept the minor. But what I learned about, you know, about that is like we all think of time in a different way or maybe even similar ways. And it's like whoever's, you know, maybe delivering the knowledge to us, of course, is going to have their own interpretation of time. But like for Navajos, or for me at least, like time is sort of like there is no past, present, or future. Like those are sort of like those are theories too. Like they're not solid, concrete things. They're so abstract. And they also suggest a linearity, but you know, I like to think of all those things happening at once, right? So like anything I do, any practice I engage in, any sort of decision I make, I think has like, you know, deep consequences for my ancestors. And like, you know, if that decision is a poor decision, that speaks on maybe their failure or my failure or whatever it may be. And it's like, if I forget those past teachings of my ancestors, that has a very significant effect on not only my present decision, but like my future decisions, right? And then also as a parent, like now, it's like my decisions that I make don't only affect me, they affect my child, they affect my partner, then they affect my parents. So it's like, when you start thinking about time that way, and it's sort of rippling effects, right? Like it's almost like a butterfly effect. You know, what you think is just a little pebble in a pond will be something more torrential for one of your relations, your colleagues or something. So like, you know, that's, if you're like walking a good path, you think about all those things, but it's really hard to think that way, I think. And that's been really challenging to talk to my students about, like, what is that thought process? You know, how do you do that? Because we're just like, you know, do the work and shut up, or like, you know, shut up, or like life is hard and then you die. And it's just like this very like prescribed binary, you're born, you're dead, you know, like what happens with all in that is like, you know, I feel like it affects everything. So how that, you know, how I translate that into my work, and which also helps me kind of sort of think that way all the time, is like, you know, when you come up with a character, what your reader sees is probably 20% of what you have created for that character or that poem or your research, right? So like, even if you're writing an academic paper, you know, there's hours and hours and hours and hours of research that you've done, but what makes it on the page is the hour and a half it takes to read your article or whatever it is. So it's like, how do you encapsulate all that time within your sentences or your word choices or your metaphors or whatever it may be? Like, how do you, especially like in my fiction collection, is like, how do I present this character who has a very tarnished past, or is an ex-con. Like this one character is an ex-con, and like the only way you know like what crime he committed is like a 3-word mention in a sentence. Is like moved product. So he got sentenced for 10 years because, you know, it was a felony. And it's like, if you know the law, if you take the time to sort of research what the penalty, like what kind of drug trafficking charge you have to get 10 years is, like, then it starts to unfold. Like, but like, that's not what the story is about. That's not what I need to tell my audience. But like, how do I signal that to them? How do I make that emotionally resonate with them with a small sort of metaphor or image, while propelling what, like, the adventure he's on now, which is like encapsulating a sort of another timeline with other characters' timelines and histories and pasts. So it's like trying to create these 3-dimensional objects, you know, within this 2-dimensional space. Like words, it's like even 1-dimensional, right? So how do you make a 1-dimensional thing turn into a, you know, abstract sort of 3-dimensional imagination? And the same thing with poetry, like, especially currents. I really tried to have a line that addressed the past, a line that addressed the present, and a line that addressed the future in some way in each of my tercets. So then it was like this continual circuit, right? It's sort of like how electricity works. It's almost like it's like we're trying, you know, like as humans, we're trying to harness fire and power, and it's so uncontrollable and still mysterious to us in a lot of ways. But like, we've done the best we can to, you know, light our houses and power all these things, but like, it's still very, you know, like one little thing could send it off into an arc, which is just like electricity finding another ground. You know, rare in cases, but it's also like, it's the potential is there, and it takes a very small error for that to happen sometimes. Yeah, I guess like I tried to take time and theorize it in my practice, you know, if that makes sense. And it is, I think it is hard to answer, you know, and it's like, it's one of those things, like, like when I tell my students when they're writing, it's like, don't share your ideas too much, or you'll just talk out your idea and then you won't write the story. Like if you were like, oh, I have the story idea, and you spend 30 minutes telling your friend, and it's like, well, you wrote the story. Instead of like waiting and like waiting until you have the finished product, right? So sometimes when I feel like I talk about time, it's like, it's ever elusive. It's like I don't ever quite get it right. But I do find, like, in some indigenous communities and non-Western communities, like their concept of time is sort of somewhat similar. They may use different language or have different metaphors for all that sort of stuff. Like Navajos, we have Hajon, which means balance of all things in the universe. Like, it's like a pretty huge word. It's also a very small word too. It just means good sometimes, or, you know, but like the idea of it is beyond sort of like definition. It's like an encapsulation of everything, you know, like what hasn't happened yet, or what has happened, or what's happening in sort of like another dimension is what I feel about it, right? And like, really, it just comes down to like, what is a good life, you know? And that's like also an unanswerable question.
I'm thinking, like, as you said all of that about so many things, I was taking down like little notes because I don't know, when it comes to craft, I'm very like tuned into that. But in this like idea that I think might be particularly hard, I know that answering about time is hard and difficult. It's difficult to think about and articulate, but in both aspects of your work of like time as a syllabus, and how do we even think about time within academia, which is something that, you know, we've also been coming across that Kiana mentioned earlier. And, we're giving a chronological order of how to read and learn things. And then we're always applying what we know and what what is new to us to the things that came before. And so it's always forever tied and entangled with just this this interpretation of how time should unfold, even though it's no longer this present moment. And I think, it's really, really cool in talking about your creative work in your writing and how you can examine time in just a snapshot in a contained moment, whether that's a sentence or a paragraph. And you're able to do that by collapsing language on itself, and to express this very abstract idea, because it almost feels like an impossibility. Honestly, I'm sitting here, I'm like, oh wow, we actually asked you to talk to us about time. What? That was so not fair of us. But it is a really incredibly interesting and hard topic. And I think just what you said about it is really thought-provoking. Yeah, Kian, I don't know if you want to follow up on anything like that, but I'm just sitting over here kind of in my head.
Yeah, similarly to your concepts of time in in Native Hawaiian culture, and I know a lot of Maori Pacific Islander, we have this concept called the now time, which it very much like how you were saying, it's very circular, and all the past, present, and future are not stagnant. They're kind of in flux with one another. And so right now, our great whatever grandchildren are doing something as a result of what we're doing right now, having this conversation and talking stories. And I think that's just so powerful, and something that I've been trying to traverse within my work with theory. How do I write an academic paper that isn't linear and doesn't have these constraints, but it's still confined to language. And I really appreciated how you were speaking about your tangible work, about how when you put something to language on a page, that's not the entirety of who you are. It's not a product of everything, all of these histories and lineages that you represent and embody. It's this very small piece of who you are. And I think that is so powerful, because that is a testament to why stories and storytelling is so necessary. And it's not just something over there fairy tales or storytelling in that sense. It's story as in who, I don't know, it's so interesting, because then storytelling becomes a way where to know it is to put in the work to know it. So how you were talking about that one little word, if you understand that one nuance of that word, then you can understand what you meant by it. But if we don't, we just gloss over that word, and we can kind of get a picture of what the writer's trying to get at. But to know someone's story, to truly know someone's story, is to go back and back and back and back, to creation. And that takes work. And that's where the tradition and the protocol and the emphasis on ancestors and honoring of the past, I think, is super powerful. And so thank you so much for sharing that in relation to your work as well. I think that was really clear and helpful to understand. And I guess that kind of leads into our last question, which is how you see your relationship to land within these stories, how you see yourself functioning between your identity in the land, and then also how you might use that in your teaching practices as well.
Excuse me. Yeah, this is a great question.
Oh no.
Wow, I just realized I was muted the whole time I was saying that. I'm so sorry.
Oh no, what happened?
I think he probably accidentally exited. I don't, but we'll give him a minute to come back in.
No worries.
Yeah.
Yeah, my internet's being weird too, and I forget if I touch these earbuds, sometimes it turns off I'm just learning to use these things. Shit, I forgot where I was. Land, right? Yeah, okay. I got to adjust this first. Don't double tap. Okay. Yeah, that's the thing I've been thinking about. I'm sort of top bits of my and the cover and it's all been a really process because it's given me the opportunity to think about my work sort of more distantly now and sort of like look at what I did instead of being so tied to it and knowing all the things and the history. So like maybe almost coming to it as a new reader. And like land has always been important to me. You know, that was something instilled in me by my uncle and grandparents. My uncle's a medicine man, he's a holy person. My grandparents were all very traditional Navajo people. And you know, it's just like, you know, it's very basic. If you care for the land, it cares for you, and like you respect the land. You know, all these things have stories. All their little pieces have stories. You know, it's not just a plant. The plant has a whole sort of being and creation myth, that how it came into being, and how it maybe sustains something else, and how it also is in relationship with all of us. You know, it's just like we're all inextricably tied together. We're all relatives. We're all family. Like even sand. Like you don't just go disturbing sand. You know, like or anthills. We used to like try to go destroy anthills because we thought they were weird looking, but my grandma was like, no, those are your like grandpas, you don't disturb them and don't look at them, you know. So it was like, you know, seems far out when you're a kid, or you're like, oh, I just want to do my own thing. And even as you get an adult, it seems childish at that point. I think, you know, you were saying like the way people treat fairy tales, like, oh, it's just fairy tale or myth. It's like, no, all these old ancient stories are very tied to the earth. Like, and why have we as a larger culture decided to ignore all that? And you know, we've entered sort of an age of self-importance, like where the self is the most important thing and not its relationship to its location. Like so like a lot of my work has a lot of those considerations. You know, there's something always wrong with the land. There's always sort of an addressing a notice of the land, a description of the land. Specifically in this collection of fiction, there's always like the land and what the characters are going through are sort of going through the same thing. Like the opening story is about a drug addict who's about to relapse, and he's also kind of falling in love with someone who's not of his culture. But he's tied up in all his addictions and sort of his traditional assimilated beliefs. So that's sort of one metaphor that throws through. But also the backdrop of this whole story is like a bark beetle infestation in the trees, which then makes everything more prone to forest fires and drought. It's a result of drought. That result of drought is the result of like the humans kind of living in disharmony, but also like, you know, building dams and like wanting to grow and not sort of respect the land in that way. So the land is sick as well. And again, those are like, that's not the point of the story. That's all in the background, right? So when I craft these things, it's like the land and the humans are both resonating, right? There's and even like in keeping with some cultural considerations, there's like a story that takes place during winter and it's a ghost story, but one of the stories alluded to is like sort of a story that is told during winter time. So keeping track of all those sort of things, and the ceremony that happens is the Yebiche, which is a winter healing ceremony. But also like in sort of keeping my sort of spiritual and sort of cultural connection to like ideas of land and setting, you know, taking artistic liberty and being like, okay, here's the sort of discordant thing that's happening. You know, here's the thing that's out of balance within the story or the character. And those are all like, those two works are very based in places I lived for a long time, which is Flagstaff and like my home up north, right, which is Flagstaff, and then also Window Rock, which is in the eastern part of Arizona, also sort of high up in elevation and very cold. I'm very much missing the cold this winter, as it's 82 degrees right now outside. I'm missing actually freezing and being buried in snow. But these things change, and like I've had the opportunity to live all over the world and travel, and my biggest thing when I travel anywhere is to read the literature of the area, so writers who are from there, both, I guess, traditional and contemporary if I can, if it's in translation, and also to like figure out what the sort of land issues are in those places, what sort of displacements have happened, what sort of ethnic minorities might have been done away with or erased. So for like for example, in Turkey, it's usually the Kurdish people or the Armenians. It's like the Armenian question, right? You don't talk about Armenia in Turkey or you get arrested or expelled or whatever. Similarly, like in Singapore, you don't really talk about the other anything really. Like that. It's largely like Filipino or like Malaysian, or it's like very class and sort of there's a big attention to like Chinese Mandarin is like the go-to language. Well, they recognize the other three languages that they have as their national languages. It's like Mandarin is the one. So like there's still this like erasure happening, and it's all like, it's all nationalist and capitalist sort of what's driven by, right? These false narratives create this like, oh, we were always here. We created this place. It's pristine in that way. So like, it's like sort of Garden of Eden thing, or like resonates with manifest destiny and the untamed wilderness of the United States, but it was a sort of a metropolis, right? So like, yeah, being attuned to those things and searching for stories. So like for here in Tucson, I'm still getting like developing my relationship to the lands, to like the Sonoran Desert, a different part of it. I've lived in Phoenix, off and on for 10 years, and sort of had a harder time cultivating that land relationship because I lived like in central downtown Phoenix. So it's, a large urban sprawl, and it took more effort to get out into the the fueras or whatever. But here it's like, you can get out, and Tucson isn't afraid of its desert. like Phoenix, like portions of Phoenix is like, with grass and like all these palm trees and fake waterways. It's like, this is sort of, these are the natural flora and fauna. So like, I view myself as a person who should care for the land here, but like also I don't know how, because my traditions don't come from this region. So it's like, okay, my responsibility now is that I am a guest here, or I like to think of myself as sort of a cultural refugee. I'm trying to learn from the Tuano Atam and the Yaqui, who are the stewards of this land. So it's like, I am a guest here, is like, while this is going to be my home and where my daughter is from, these are not our homelands. We are guests here. We are seeking refuge here. So it's like, just thinking of Tucson, it's a lot like Flagstaff. It's like a second home. A lot of second homeowners, live in those places and drive up the prices and change the political and cultural dynamics. And it's like, there's so many people who don't think that way. It's, we've occupied this. This is ours. We own it, and things are this way now. It's like, no, we're guests. So. That's again, that's an undercurrent of my in my work. I'm setting some stories here, and it's like, I'm trying to figure out how to be very transparent, but not over explaining that, like, I am not from here. I am I don't know, for lack of a better metaphor, like stranger in a strange land. I like keeping that lens and keeping that sort of theoretical maybe idea in my brain, so that I'm not like a Tucson writer, because I'm not. I just pay rent here.
Yeah, I love that. I love the cultural refugee. I think that's like a great way of putting it, of just knowing one's positionality in any space that we occupy, and acknowledging that, honoring that, and respecting that, I think does a lot of healing and recuperation. Because yeah, that's something that this project initially started with all of us kind of talking about the issue with land acknowledgement at our university. And we are like, okay, how do we honor and address land? And we are like going back and forth with like all of these different like potential solutions that we could kind of venture into. And one of the things we ran into was we ourselves, by doing that to some degree, like perpetuate that that colonization, and by even existing on the land. So I think the more we hear through this project, the more and more we hear these stories, it all comes down to, as simple as you put it, like how to live a good life and how to honor and respect what came before through our present, and in that it enacts what will come in the future. So thank you so much for that answer. Like I'm just so humbled and honored to share space with you and hear you. I was looking forward to this all week, and we do have a closing protocol. We just like to kind of just honor something that we will take away from this space, which for me, I feel very, very validated in this route and this path that I'm taking. I know sometimes it's been really hard for me to kind of push up against the academy and the values and culture that I grew up in. And so to hear scholars and thinkers and artists that are aligned in this type of thinking and these thoughts, it's very validating for me, and kind of just reminds me that my ancestors placed me on this path, and for our paths to intersect for a reason that I will not know in this lifetime. So I'm really honored, and I thank you so much.
I think the more that I talk with everybody in this project, and it's been especially true in this conversation with you, it's just felt really good to have a space of easy conversation in an environment where we're always being pushed to, seek out truth in like this very horrible way, or like create new knowledge. And it's really kind of lonely in that sense, because you're very much having to focus on what you're doing and like your own work and how you're contributing to something, but it's not very clear what you're contributing to, especially when you are being encouraged to make a name for yourself independently. And so in this project, I've really appreciated working on it with Kiana and Shione, because it's like really allowed us to really explore a topic as a group and talk about what that means and form this relationship. And then in having these conversations, it's just like allowed us to form really just kind of not, I don't want to say casual, but like, to me, it feels like a genuine, easy sort of connection with people who share this space of, being in the academy, of being in a position that we could be in the future, of just like having these roles. And so as a general just kind of appreciation, I've really liked creating this space with people where there's no right or wrong. It's just getting to know each other and talking to each other. And in particular today, I really appreciate just how much of yourself you shared with us, because a lot of our questions are very abstract, and they just felt very kind of embodied both in you and your work. And I think that's just like something that is really wonderful and should be like shared and valued more. Even though, like, I know it's hard because it's it's the university, right? But I really appreciate that you took the time to do that with us. And I'm definitely going to be like taking your words and just what you shared with us as I continue on in my own work. So thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for having me. It was, it was an honor for me too to engage with thinkers who are, in your position, and be able to have this conversation. It helps me greatly too to have these abstract questions that I don't think about, and people are seeing people think along similar lines or parallel whatever thought processes is really actually refreshing for me. So I appreciated it too. So thank you very much.